Hi, everybody. I'm Christy Bishop, and welcome to What Nobody Tells Us. Today's episode is all about patient advocacy, which is a topic that came up again and again from people and friends and listeners of the Corolla Show and strangers who we've met over the years during during Bryan's brain tumor journey. This is a topic that people have really requested and need help with. So I'm bringing it up so everyone can get the tips and tricks, not only from myself, but from my guest today, whose name is Kelly Donahue. Kelly has spent her career in, ironically, hospice mediation and marketing and healthcare. And she also currently works for doing mediation for incarcerated individuals looking to restart their lives and get new jobs. In addition to her communications background, Kelly is also the primary or co-patient advocate and caregiver for her dad, who was diagnosed with AML, which is a specific type of leukemia, in April of 2022. Now, much like myself in 2009, Kelly was thrust into this patient advocacy role out of nowhere. Her dad was diagnosed, much like Bryan, out of nowhere. He was an incredibly fit, healthy individual, fitter, as Kelly will tell you later on in the episode, fitter than every single person in their family. Biking hundreds of miles on Peloton, playing, 58, 60 rounds of golf in a weekend, but leukemia struck. So Kelly and I have a really important conversation about what to do to effectively advocate for a patient, how to communicate with care teams, medical professionals, how to effectively get your point across and educate yourself so you actually can go into these conversations feeling confident and like you can get somewhere and that you're not just subject to the system. Then you don't just honestly fall victim to the patient being a number. The patient is a person. The patient is a dad, a mom, a sister, a brother, a wife, a husband, a daughter, a son, a friend. They're not just a number in the system. And patient advocates, it's our responsibility to make sure that the patients get what they need in a timely manner and that the care team around the patient, including the doctor and the medical staff, are equally committed as advocates around the patient and getting them the care that they need so they can have the best chances for survival, which is such a strange word to think about survival, but it's true. And not just go into remission or have their tumor or whatever illness it might be, either go into remission or completely healed and removed altogether, but survive. Patient advocacy is incredibly difficult job on top of everything else that someone already has going on in their life, and it changes everything. No one asks for this, but we also talk about the types of personality that really do thrive and succeed as patient advocates and the other types of roles that can support patient advocates. And speaking of support, how patient advocates can support themselves during this very, very difficult journey, whether it's short, medium, or long. It doesn't matter, because if you can't support yourself, you're not going to be any good at supporting others. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Kelly and I. I learned a lot from her, and her dad is actually getting a bone marrow transplant this week. So please send your prayers, your energy, your good vibes, whatever you have out into the world for her dad. And total quick other separate announcement. This week, Bryan and I are actually speaking. We are keynote speakers at the American Brain Tumor Association conference in Chicago, and you can live stream that event should you be interested in listening to his patient perspective and my caregiver perspective. It's this Friday, and we are so looking forward to it and feel completely honored that that Bryan was asked, and then he invited me to join him for the ride, which I couldn't be more thrilled about. And we are so excited. So thank you to the ABTA for having us. Thank you to you for listening to this episode and to all my other episodes of What Nobody Tells Us. And without further ado, here is our conversation on patient advocacy. Hi, Kelly. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining What Nobody Tells Us.
I am happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Are you kidding? Please. This is such an important topic. And when Sheridan introduced us, I was like, this is going to be magic, because I've had a lot of people ask about patient advocacy. I have a lot of experience in it, but your story and your experience, I think, are going to help so many people. So I'm really excited to share it.
Well, I am always a firm believer that hard things that happen in life, if you can use them to support other people, it just makes that experience that you went through more meaningful. So I'm hoping this is helpful. Certainly, my sister-in-law thought you and I connecting would be helpful, and I'm happy to share.
You've had a really interesting career, and if I may, a serendipitous career where in the moment it might just look like a job or just look like part of your career trajectory, but when you look back on it, it actually was helping prepare you for something much larger. Can you please talk about how your career in healthcare and mediation helped prepare you for a very, very personal situation with your dad?
Absolutely. I first started out as an AmeriCorps when I left college, and I was placed with a mediation company or not mediation nonprofit, which is essentially a conflict resolution center. So helping people move through conflict, helping people communicate more effectively. And I did both service delivery, training for new mediators, and or people in the community that hired us, as well as marketing, which is actually my full time role now. Almost a decade later. And so that was definitely the first part of my journey. I think as we get deeper into this, we talk a lot about patient advocacy having a lot to do with communication. And so having those foundational skills, I had no idea a decade later would be so meaningful. But as I grew in that organization, it was a healthcare nonprofit. We worked with hospice and home health patients. And so I really got a clear understanding of the healthcare system and how to navigate that, which, as you can imagine, is a really transferable skill for patient advocacy,
Mhm.
because you understand healthcare and how it works more acutely. And when you get that perspective, I think it makes you feel more confident in being able to approach patient advocacy, which I think oftentimes is the hardest part. It's just feeling confident in being able to advocate for yourself or your loved one. And then now I do communication and marketing for a different nonprofit. We work with those who are justice involved, currently or formerly incarcerated. And a lot of my role is storytelling. It's PR and it's marketing, but it's also storytelling, helping people change their minds about really hard topics, um, or nuanced topics, and helping people tell their stories. And as far away from patient advocacy as you might think that would be, a lot of advocacy is really being able to tell a story, but you're with your healthcare provider, being able to accurately talk about what's happening, with your healthcare provider or with others, and being able to have tough conversations, which is so much of what my job is. It's just in a particularly different field. So those three pieces kind of came together in this serendipitous way, I suppose, where I thought, gosh, without all this professional experience, I just would have felt really out of my element trying to be a good patient advocate for my dad.
Now, obviously, professional preparation is one thing, but personal preparation for patient advocacy and caregiving is quite another. Are you able to share a little bit about your dad's diagnosis with leukemia and what happened in April 2022?
Yeah. So, about a year, a little over a year and a half ago, so April of 2022, we got a phone call. I got a phone call from my parents, and a routine blood test had shown that my dad was neutropenic. And that is something, a phrase that I can say confidently these days, but at that point, I had no idea what that meant. And it's a particular type of white blood cell that was almost absent in his system, and it was indicative of leukemia. And so, we found out within a day or two that he did have acute myeloid leukemia, which is an aggressive leukemia, that can affect everyone, but tends to affect older adults, although there are people of all ages who have AML. And it was very clear how aggressive it was right away. And so it was not 3 days later that he began chemo treatment. So that kind of gives you some perspective on how acute the leukemia was from the get go.
You mentioned to me when we had like our first chat that he had done a routine blood test and that the doctors called him back and said like you need to come in like right away.
Yeah, it was actually his cardiologist. He's the most fit, healthiest guy, is always on top of his healthcare, and his cardiologist called at 9 o'clock at night and just said, "You need to get to a hospital now. We need to do additional testing, and you need to be really careful because when you're neutropenic, you don't really have much of an immune system." So, yeah, it was very routine, no symptoms, no inclination that anything was wrong. He's a very healthy, fit um, person, and I certainly look at him and he's like in better shape than everyone in our family. So it was a surprise for all of us to have this diagnosis, and we had never really dealt with anything like this before. I mean, we've had cancer in our extended family and been through that process before, but um, not within our immediate family, certainly. And this journey is a long one. It's not a quick. There's not a quick fix to this particular type of cancer, and so we knew we were in for a marathon, so to speak.
Hmm. I mean, I understand the marathon for sure, without a doubt. And I have to take myself back. I can only speak from my perspective, but you're reminding me a lot of like the very beginning where someone gets a very surprise out of nowhere diagnosis, which is
Right.
exactly what happened with my husband and his brain tumor diagnosis. And immediately everyone can respond differently. And that was one thing I was not prepared for, was how everyone responded. I responded one way, his parents responded a different way, my parents responded a different way, our friends responded a different way, the doctor obviously responded a different way, the insurance system definitely responded a different way.
Oh gosh.
Right, but what happened, and kind of what different reactions, if you will, did different people in your orbit start to exhibit, including yourself?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, it makes me kind of emotional even thinking back to that first day because we've been in it for so long. I forget that there was a world before leukemia, if that
Yeah,
makes sense. And
yeah,
so
absolutely,
those
yes.
first few days, gosh, it's emotional thinking about it again because there
Okay.
was a world, there was a world before this, and that transition is pretty drastic for everyone in the family, and it looks different. Um, myself and my mom are very much action oriented. We're doers, um, and so we just moved to action. I mean, that was just a natural fit for both of us. And to really start, I have a psychology background, and so I understand research methods, and so I also started looking at research and diving deep into understanding the language behind this disease and what's available and what we're encountering because it's incredibly complex. And I may have studied psychology, but I'm not a doctor.
Mhm.
And, trying to make sense of that and figure out what the next step forward looks like, which in that position, it's incredibly daunting, and
Yeah.
you feel overwhelmed, and you're both navigating grief and you're also trying to take a step forward, and doing both those things at once can be complicated. And so something that I did that was different maybe than other people in my family is I knew based off of my work with hospice, we had a bereavement center in our organization, and I worked with that team often
Mhm.
to help get marketing out to the community and talk about grief and death and dying. I've never been afraid of hard topics. I actually like kind of going towards the pointy things, so to speak. And because of that work, I knew that I needed to go to an anticipatory grief therapist.
Mhm.
And that was something different than other people in my family. And I think nothing right or wrong, but I just knew because of my background, I would need that support in
Can you
that
explain
place.
what that is? What an anticipatory grief
Absolutely.
session
I know a lot of people haven't heard of it, but anticipatory grief is essentially either you or someone you love or care for has a potential diagnosis or a potential disease in which there may be a terminal outcome. So sometimes it's certain. So, there are some people that get terminal diagnoses and with certainty. In my dad's case, he wasn't deemed terminal, but it is a really serious and severe um, diagnosis. And anticipation of potential grief
is.
needs to be processed just as much as certain grief. And that certain grief looks like someone has passed and you're grieving that person. But what happens before a person passes? Or maybe they never pass, but you don't know what that's going to look like. That is also grief as well. it just looks different. It manifests in different ways. It can come in anxiety. It can come in racing thoughts. It can come in absolute avoidance. There's a lot of different ways that people deal with anticipatory grief. And I think oftentimes people are afraid to go to anticipatory grief because they think they're sentencing a person to that outcome. If
Hmm.
I go and talk about the fact that I'm grieving, then maybe it'll make it real. And it's actually the opposite is that by making the potential of it real, you are giving yourself this incredible gift of processing and um, exploring all of the components of what that could look like or feels like in the moment. And I found for me that it made me a better advocate and it made me a better caregiver, it made me a better daughter, a better partner, because I had that space where I could be totally selfish and talk about my worst fears and my anxieties and then find ways to navigate that and not be so afraid to say it out loud, which can be hard with other family members. You can't always say things out loud um, because it can be scary. You don't know how they're going to respond, they're going to react, and so it felt like a really safe place to be able to do that.
Hmm. I had never heard of it until honestly a few months ago. And then you brought it up just recently. And it was something I so desperately wish that I had had back in the day. But again, I was 29 years old and just about to turn 30 when this happened. And honestly, I don't know if I would have been ready for it because
Right.
I'm very action oriented too, like sprung into action. And we'll talk
Right.
about that as well. But I think one of the most important things to understand about patient advocacy is it's not just like someone has to advocate for the patient, yes, of course, but you also have to navigate your own emotions, the
Mm-hmm.
emotions and the dynamics of family, the emotions and the dynamics of others, of those people around you, and navigate your own grief. And it's,
Yeah.
I had a really powerful episode on grief last week or a few weeks ago, and it doesn't have to be about loss. Like to your
Mm-hmm.
point, it's about the emotions that are very complicated as you're going through this. But I had the opposite response. Like I went into full fledged action, but I remember sitting in the radiation center with Bryan, like terrified. Both of us, like just literally might as well have been shaking chihuahuas. And a volunteer, a very kindly elderly volunteer came up who's clearly seen everything, done everything, had everything at
Right.
Cedars-Sinai Hospital and was very ready to talk. And we were very not ready to talk.
Right.
It was like if we said anything out loud, even though we were sitting there every single day in the radiation center, it would make it even more real. And
Mm-hmm.
admitting it was real to someone else out loud meant he was going to die because
Yeah.
we didn't know. So, right. So it,
Absolutely. I think what you're talking about is really mostly common. I think that's mostly people's responses. And honestly, had I not had my experience working in hospice for 6 years, I
mhm,
probably would have had a similar response. I
mhm,
just You're afraid to say these things out loud. You give yourself a lot of power. Like if I say it out loud, I have all this power
mhm.
to influence, the future. So I think what you're talking about is totally normal, and I resonate with that because that would have been me had I not had that
Mhm.
experience.
So what did you do that was different because of your experience in terms of jumping into action, the things you knew you needed to do, putting aside your own grief, which you were handling through those anticipatory grief sessions? What
Right.
action step did you take to start to advocate?
So, becoming familiar with the language, I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier, was really important. I wanted to be able to at least have a basic foundational knowledge of what certain terms meant within the field. Things like measurable residual disease, which is how much cancer is left behind after treatment, and genetic mutations, which are the different types of mutations that can happen that can lead to the cancer to begin with, and understanding what a neutrophil was, all of those things. That was the first thing I wanted to do because I wanted to be able to understand. Something I understood when I was a mediator was that understanding is the building block for being able to move forward. So if I can't understand at a basic level, we're going to be missing a component of what we will need to be a good advocate. So that was the first thing that I did, is really just trying to deeply understand this insidious disease. And then I I kind of had a we met with a couple of doctors, and I'm sure most people in this position do the same. You're in denial. Well, let's get another opinion. Let's get a second opinion, a third opinion. And what I realized through that process, first of all, it's okay to ask for that. You won't offend
No,
a doctor by asking for another opinion. So first
absolutely.
giving ourselves permission to get other opinions and seek expertise like you
Yep.
would. I mean, it's silly, but if you are remodeling your home, you might interview lots of contractors.
Sure.
You don't just do the first contractor you meet with. So why would you not do the same thing for your own health, especially if your life is contingent upon that or your
Mhm.
loved one's life is contingent upon that. So I think giving myself permission and our family permission to do that was really important. And then learning how to communicate with our healthcare providers, and not just healthcare, but insurance,
Mhm.
in a way that was both advocating but also compassionate. And that's a balance, right? I don't want to come in and think I know everything, but I also want to come in and ask the right questions, ask tough questions, and make sure that we are working together as a team and that it's not doctor led. It's a reciprocal relationship between the care provider team, the patient, and the family. So those were
Mhm.
the first few things that we did, but there was a lot that happened. So
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that happened. I'm so glad that you mentioned the first, second, and third opinion because I feel like there are a lot of people out there like who don't have the benefit of living in a large city with a lot of different options and who maybe don't have the benefit of the education who will just go to a doctor, the closest doctor, because again, they're in a state of panic, a state of denial, a state of shock potentially, and just overwhelming emotion. And they'll go and they'll just listen to whatever this doctor's saying and
right,
not stop the doctor to ask them to explain in layman's terms what they mean.
right.
Um, One of the first things that I did when we had a doctor who sentenced Bryan to 6 months to 12 months to live without even showing us an MRI. And he literally, we didn't even know it was cancer. I actually don't even know if I've told the story. We didn't even know it was cancer until we literally showed up to the St. John's Cancer Center and I saw cancer written on the front door. That's how I knew we were dealing with cancer.
Yeah.
And it was this doctor who was not largely older than us. And he pulled us in, got on his little rolly stool, rolled up right up next to, right in front of us, handed us a pamphlet that he had so graciously taken the liberty of highlighting. And he's like, I've highlighted the most important things for you. And literally, I read the front of the pamphlet and it said a patient's guide to brain cancer. And that is how we found out that Bryan had brain cancer. We both went into a complete state of shock and we didn't know what to do. I actually started hyperventilating in the hallway. Like they had to remove me from the room, hide me from the lobby. And it was the first and last time in my life I've ever gotten a paper bag. I thought that was only a scene out of movies. Like that actually
Well,
happens, right? It's bananas. And then eventually we learned, no, 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 no. This is not like you're just one person. You're one person, you're one opinion, and Bryan is Bryan. He's not patient number XYZ. So we ended up finding this other doctor at Cedar Sinai. And one of the first things I said to him was, do not give us a reason to be afraid of you.
mhm,
Do not do it. Like people give up all their power and all their controls to doctors, but doctors are practicing medicine. There's a reason that people say that. There's a reason. They're practicing. They are not God,
right.
right? So like taking
Wow.
that power back is so powerful. It's so important.
There's something you said there that, first of all, I want to, first, before anything, I just want to say that how I'm so sorry that that was your experience with learning this incredibly difficult diagnosis. It breaks my heart because having been in a similar position, um, and how much I value communication, it,
Mhm.
it, it can be the worst moment of people's lives, and being able to gently learn that information in a compassionate and empathetic way is so important. It doesn't remove the pain or the shock, but it does feel like you're safe, right? It feels like
Yes.
someone has your best, kind of like your best interest in mind, and to not have that safety while you're also essentially traumatized is like taking the soft landing out of an already tough, you know, plane crash. It's like you're just
Yeah.
the rug underneath your feet. So I'm so sorry that that happened. And something that you mentioned that I think was really valuable was that that idea of like, don't give us a reason to, was it hate you or just be scared of you? There you go. We had an experience like that with one oncologist who we did not go with, where
Mhm.
I was left feel like I still feel trauma from that, moment where we were not handled gently, we were not handled with care, and we were told it was dismal. And I think one of the best things people can do is not just find the right care provider that knows the best path forward from a clinical perspective, but the right care provider that's going to work for your family's personality.
Yes.
Because the oncologist, we have an oncology team kind of all over California at this point, but the oncologist that we have based in San Luis Obispo, where I'm from, he is such an advocate for my dad. And he's so
Huge.
compassionate. He knows exactly how to talk to my dad in a way that, and he listens, and he wants to hear him, and he knows how to talk with him in a way that my dad can hear him as well. It's not just the doctor listening, but you want the information you're receiving to be also be heard by the patient. And there's a flexing of style that you have to be able to do as a doctor to do that. And he's incredible and such a powerful advocate. And so finding that care person that's going to advocate for you as much as you're going to advocate for them. Wow. I mean, it is a life changer. He walked up to another oncologist at a conference and said, "You have to meet my patient. You have to meet him."
Mm-hmm.
And normally they wouldn't have taken him, but because he advocated for him, they took him on as a patient for this new treatment they were doing. What
Mm-hmm.
incredible advocacy!
Beyond.
No one's paying him to do that, but he believes in him enough and has built rapport with him enough that he is willing to be as much of an
Yeah.
advocate as we are. And that's what you have to look for in the beginning.
Will you explain that story? Because I think the details of that story are so, and we have similar stories too, but that is such a wildly important point. Like, you're not just the advocate, the doctor has to be the advocate against the
Absolutely.
system and to find clinical trials and to convince other people in. Like, they have to
Right.
essentially be like a prosecutor to
Yeah.
get certain opportunities and therapies and treatments and
Right.
opening of doors. Like, what happened with that doctor
Well, it's
from
funny
San
you say that because my dad is an attorney. So I may have learned a couple of skills from him also that I didn't mention. And so with AML, they typically treat younger patients differently than they treat patients over the age of 60. It's just their general protocol. But my dad has more of the fitness level of someone under 60. He Peloton's 50 miles a week, and he's just incredibly active and healthy and fit. And so he's really strong. He's capable of taking pretty challenging treatments, which we've seen. But when he fell out of remission this last spring, right before he was about to do his bone marrow transplant, they were giving him some chemo that wasn't working. And he really needed more aggressive treatment that typically would be reserved for people under the age of 60. And at this point, his doctor in SLO knew he could handle it. He was like, "I believe in you, Bob. I think that you are fit enough for this, but we have to convince the kind of treatment you need needs to be at a tertiary hospital." My parents had moved from LA to SLO in the last year, terrible timing, um, to move from a bigger city to a smaller community to have this type of disease. And so he found a oncologist at a tertiary hospital at a conference he was speaking at and said, "You have to meet him.
Mhm.
He is capable of this treatment. You just need to meet him and get to know him and understand his fitness level and his capacity. He can do it, but you need to meet him in order to believe it."
Mhm.
And so that oncologist agreed to meet with my dad, and we drove up to the Bay Area. And within 30 minutes, it was very clear to him, like, okay, he was right. He did advocate for you appropriately, and he decided to take my dad on as a patient. And my dad did tolerate the treatment really well, and it hasn't ended there, but that advocacy is going above and beyond, in my opinion, and it's what you need, because especially in complicated cancer cases,
Mhm.
you are in a marathon and you need someone guiding you every step of the way. And sometimes you don't know, as a family member, you're given fork in the road, and you don't know which path to take. And as much as I'm an advocate, I still am not a doctor.
Right.
And I need my doctor to also be, or my dad's doctor to also be, the advocate to help us choose that path. And so that was pretty profound. I mean, it was like, who says to another doctor at a conference, like, "You got to meet my guy," I mean, it just was actually kind of endearing as well. And so that got him into that treatment. which was really important because it was the next step before what he's doing now, which is a clinical trial.
You know what? It's funny you say like what doctor would do that. I think a lot of doctors do that because like Bryan is the longest living patient at Cedars-Sinai with this condition. And literally his doctor, his neuro-oncologist calls him, he's like, you're my Picasso. Like,
Yeah.
so, like the other doctors want to show off their Picassos and help them along because as much as they don't want to get emotionally invested, like
Mhm.
it's funny you said a slip of the tongue. You said my doctor. I mean my dad's doctor. I think a lot of caregivers are and patient advocates, it's not just my husband's doctor. It's not just your dad's doctor. It's our doctor because
Right.
it's our team together and
Yes.
everyone needs to be marching in the same direction, speaking the same language. And you can't be afraid. I'm just going to throw my tips in here too. Like you can't be afraid to stop somebody from saying something that you don't understand or getting over their skis. Like there's times last week when my husband was approved for this incredible breakthrough drug, which we were hoping so much he would be. But when his doctor started to explain it, I was like, well, hold on, hold on. Like you're back in your language. Come back to me. Come back
Yeah.
to us.
Speaking in terms that I can understand.
Correct. And
Yeah.
how do you feel? Because I want to also talk about like how you prep for appointments and like how you prepare and have those hard conversations about documents that need to be in order, like should the worst happen. But before we do you find that your dad's doctor team, since you're the primary advocate, do they treat you with like profound respect as well? And so it's not just talking to your dad all the time and pretending you're not in the room, like you're fully part of the conversations.
Yes. So there have been times in the past with former oncologists I haven't felt that way.
Hmm.
Um, but they obviously aren't our current oncologists for that reason. So
Exactly.
just because we met with someone doesn't mean that they became part of our care team. But in our current care team, yes. And I think it you have to develop trust,
Hmm.
and that is hard when doctors are seeing so many patients, and I'm sure there's plenty of patients that family members come in kind of swinging. They're just because they want to advocate for their patient. So I had to I get taken seriously as an advocate because I've also developed and built trust with them, and it's how I communicate that's been really helpful. And it's also how we prepare for the appointments that's
Hmm.
been helpful because we kind of know what to anticipate and we prepare things ahead of time. And then I'm also really clear with my communication style that I trust this doctor as a clinician, but I need them to develop trust with me.
Hmm.
So I might trust that they are a good clinician, but how are you going to build trust with me that my dad's being cared for? Which is different. It's a different thing that you can have respect for someone and their credentials and their knowledge and their experience, but you still need to build trust with me about how we're going to care for my dad.
Correct.
And you can do that in a couple of ways. I try to ask really open-ended questions rather than pointed questions because I think, let's be honest, I know I didn't go to medical school for 8 years, but I learned enough to know that I can at least ask some pretty good questions. And if I ask them in an open way, it's inviting for me to learn more. I'm just basically saying, look, this is what I understand, but I'm curious about X, Y, and Z. Can you share more with me about that? And it's basically saying, I have this question. I need clarity from you, but I'm willing to hear from you what that'll look like rather than saying, I think I know everything and you better tell me why you're right or wrong, which I think can cause someone to feel defensive in any profession, whether you're a doctor or other profession. So I try and approach with more open ended questions that invite storytelling from the doctor as opposed to, I know better,
Yeah.
which I think builds good rapport with the doctor.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, nobody wants to be insulted, but at
Right.
the same time, like you need to be an active listener and not be afraid to ask something that you don't understand and give the
Absolutely.
doctor an opportunity to explain it. Or
Right.
a lot of times it's not the doctors, it's like the nurse practitioner or it's the person standing at the computer giving taking all of the notes, like to stop them and say, hold again, getting over your skis or getting over my skis.
Right.
Let's explain it back to me a little bit. When you talk about prepping for appointments, like one of the things that I did early days when I was just in the fog and panic and stress and had no idea about anything, like not one clue about brain tumors for obvious reasons. I got
Right.
a big fat notebook. Like I got like a
Mhm.
proper keeper. It had Velcro, it was bright orange. It was like it might as well have just said 911 on the front of it. and I put every single note, like I took
Mhm.
notes, handwritten notes, like I was back in grad school, handwritten notes of every single appointment. I would ask the doctor to slow down so I could write things. This was like, pre iPhones being everybody's note taking device.
Right.
And I actually kept a clear slip in it to put every single doctor's, like you talk about a care team. Care
Right.
team can be honestly like upwards of double digits of people that you're going to see over time. I kept every single one of their business cards, which was a thing to do back then, in a clear sleeve with small notes written on the back of it. And some of them would be so gracious enough to give us their cell phone number or their
Amazing. Yeah.
personal email. So you just have it all right there. So you don't have to rely on a foggy memory to
Mhm.
actually keep this data straight. But how do you guys prep for appointments? And you as the lead in patient advocacy, like
Yeah.
what is your role?
Well, first of all, I'm very lucky to have my mom as like my co-advocate here. We both have our strengths, and I think that's been really nice to have like a co-captain in that way.
Mhm.
She's incredibly detail oriented and incredibly organized, and I'm a systems person, and I like strategy and research and systems, and she's really meticulous. So together, we're like this powerful duo.
You're unstoppable. Yes, I love
Right.
this.
And so we have actually two notebooks now. We have a calendar
Mhm.
that's that kind of dictates treatment plans and where we're going to be, where he's going to be, so we can see things big picture,
Mhm.
because there's a lot of moving parts. And then we also have the notebook where my mom will meticulously take notes the entire time that we're talking. I would also take notes on my phone, or I would even record as long as they said they were okay with it.
Yes.
Um, Obviously, like every doctor is different, but I hadn't met a doctor that wasn't okay with that. And so we took notes and we recorded things because it's really hard to be in those in those calls when it's telehealth or those appointments and hear hard news or hear something difficult and not go into fight or flight.
Yeah.
Our body immediately goes into fight or flight, and it's worse for the patient, right? So it's good to have an advocate there because the patient's experiencing it the most. My dad, it's his body that they're talking about. So he's not thinking clearly. I mean, he's probably being really introspective when he's hearing these things. What does it mean for me? And you miss a lot when you're in that space. And having taught communication for a decade, when you go into fight or flight, the frontal lobe portion of your brain starts to shut down. You start losing blood to that portion of your brain. That's your rational, logical portion of your brain that's supposed to help you critically think, remember things, and process. And that you're losing access to that part of your brain while adrenaline pumps through your system. And it's supposed to get you ready for, fighting or fleeing like a mountain lion. But instead of facing a mountain lion, you're facing a cancer diagnosis. And so having notes, having recordings can be really helpful because you aren't always a reliable source for
Mm.
your own appointments with doctors.
Yes.
That was definitely something we do to prepare for when we go into meetings, but also knowing what we were going to talk about in advance. So if it's like, okay, he needs XYZ treatment and he only qualifies if he's super healthy, how are we going to make sure the doctor understands that? So I walked through it with my dad. I'm like, what do you typically do for exercise? And let's
Mhm.
make sure we hit each of those marks. And he's like, well, I did 58 holes of golf last weekend. I rode the Peloton 50 miles. I'm like, that has to be said. And it
Yes.
feels silly because you feel like you're boasting or you're maybe sharing things that aren't important. But if you're prepared when you go into that appointment and you are thinking through some of the things they might ask you, you're giving them more information. It's still storytelling. You still have to share your story with them so they can know what to do best for you. Otherwise, you will just be a patient number on a
Mhm.
chart. Um, and we also talk about the support we have in our team. So our team being our family, we talk a lot about family support and who's there to support. And I didn't know this in the beginning, but I noticed it on the paperwork after we meet with oncologists. They would write down this patient has a huge support system, we have family nearby, um, all physical needs covered. This patient literally did 58 holes of golf, Peloton's X number of miles a week. And I realized, oh my gosh, if that's in their doctor notes, that means it's important. And gosh, we have to be on top of that and be really lead with that. And I think oftentimes people are too afraid, or maybe whether you're shy or scared or don't know it's important,
Mhm.
that's such a huge tip is if you have that team, lead with that. If you have that health background, lead with that. So your doctor knows who you are as a person and not just a patient number on a doc, you know.
Yeah, and also that they'll be held accountable, at the same time,
Absolutely.
because you're gonna have you or your mom or your dad, if he's able to ask these questions or push back, because I think about people that we saw in the radiation center years and years ago who literally had no one. No
Yeah.
one, and they then moved from a different place. There was a gentleman from, I don't even know where, somewhere in Europe, who had literally flown over to be treated here by himself, and had
Yeah.
to get himself there alone, had to listen to the appointments alone, and I think the fight or flight notion that you're saying is so critical, and something else, like, you have your mom to balance you out, which is I mean, God, you sound like just the best dynamic duo. You're the patient advocate dream, honestly, but there are so many times where I will have gone into fight or flight and need those notes. Or Bryan is always, even though he will not admit it, in fight or flight, or he's under the I'll just say terrible impacts of chemotherapies, like
Right.
terrible, brutal, awful, where he thinks his brain is fine. And I will tell you what, it was not a
No.
lot of times. So
Chemo
they'll
therapy is so, so tough.
Oh, it's so tough, and I'm like, "You don't know where your shoes are, like, they're next to you, they're right
Mhm.
there." You think you're about to go to a doctor's appointment alone and just report back? The answer is absolutely not. So it's like for people out there who have, and luckily we are such a team that, like, there's not a world where he's ever said to me, "I'm going to this appointment alone." If
Yeah.
anything, he's like, "Wait, why can't you come with me? Like, let's go together." But there are a lot of very strong-willed patients out there,
Mhm.
and I would say to strong patient advocates, if they're ever like, "No, no, I got this one." It's like, "No." Also, like, they don't got it. They don't have it, and they need you there for the moral support, but also for the clinical support and the detail
Absolutely.
support.
And I think it's interesting you touch on this because where my dad's being treated right now, I do see a lot of people who are there by themselves.
Mhm.
And it breaks my heart. And I've had a lot of time to think about this, that the way our healthcare system is set up, the way that we operate around illness in this country, not everyone can do what I'm doing, right? I have the privilege of working remotely, and so I can work from anywhere.
Same.
So I can be at my dad's doctor's appointments. I have, some financial privilege, and that like I can be flexible, and go to doctor's appointments when need be, even if they're out of the city I live in. I think there's a lot of privilege involved in being taken seriously or having the resources to be able to advocate for someone.
Mhm.
And I don't think it should be that way. There
No.
should be better resources. People should be able to get time off to take care of their loved ones and not have to worry about how they're going to pay their bills. Um, and I think we need to work on that more in our healthcare system. But I'm not. It's not lost on me that the advice I'm giving, some of it isn't possible for people, and
Yeah.
that doesn't feel fair. I'm glad that I'm in that position and can do so, but I recognize that not everything that I'm sharing is possible. So hopefully, if anyone's listening who's going through this and they feel like, yeah, it would be nice if I could do that. Um, I think sometimes also having grace with yourself and saying the best I can do is enough.
Yeah.
If you can't take time off work, but you can call in. So right now I'm not with my dad, and I'm calling in to listen to the doctor, even though I can't be present with him. And that right now has to be enough. And so, I think there's a huge burden that caregivers and advocates take on. Like, you can control everything and you can do everything. And if you don't, then you're failing the person that you love. The reality is the best that you can give is always going to be enough. And you have to have grace with yourself because this system is not perfect. It's not built that way. So I just wanted to mention that because I realized that that's not going to be everyone's circumstances.
No, it's such a beautiful reminder I mean, the healthcare system as a whole, my God, 72 other conversations and we wouldn't get anywhere. And like, that's the sad reality of it. And we've seen too much of it. But I mean, again, I love that advice. The best you can do is enough, for yourself and for the patient. Like, literally, there are ways to make things work, and sometimes there's not. And that's just the hard reality of things. But if for anyone who can do some of these things, or at least be creative about problem
Mhm.
solving with it, that's the best you can
Oh my
do.
gosh, I have FaceTimed in to my dad's doctor's appointments or into the
Sure.
hospital. I'm like, hold that phone up. They're going to see my face. I'm going to ask them some questions. And I'm like,
Oh,
gosh,
yeah,
this wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. So there are a lot of, technology tricks to be able to access, that communication with the doctor, even if you can't physically be present.
absolutely. You just made me think of a different thing too, is like, assuming you're with your dad's doctor for a very long time, and we've been with Brian's care team for 14 years, like
Mhm.
we know his schedule. Like we know like
Yeah.
Wednesday mornings are like the tumor board. And so
Yeah.
we're often there after the tumor board. And so we'll be there at the appointments often at like 8:30 or 9 in the morning. And they're typically like 45 minutes late. And in the beginning, when we didn't know it was the tumor board beforehand, tumor board, for those who don't know, is like where all of the neuro-oncologists and the neurosurgeons and the care providers get together and they talk about specific really difficult cases that are maybe like emergency, truly like nearing the end cases, and what can we do, or maybe there's a
Right.
new drug out there to apply new therapy, and the eligibility of the patient. So we would get really frustrated. We're like, my God, like where are they? Like, this,
Mhm.
because your anxiety is kicking in, your PTSD is kicking in, which we'll also talk about. But then once we learned that like they were in the tumor board talking about people who literally were dying, and like we had the privilege, I will use it lightly, but sitting there healthy enough to wait for 45 minutes,
Yeah.
like we were not life or death that day. So like
Right.
learn the patient or the doctor's schedule, like
Yeah.
understand and be graceful with their situation too, because they have so many other patients. But like you're an important one as well if you do all these
Right.
things that we talked about, but give them grace because they're the ones seeing this every single day. And I think it impacts the best doctors more than we'll ever understand.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Um, I think we're all human beings, right? I've been on the other side. I've been in healthcare, so we are all human beings having this experience together. And so having grace with yourself and grace with others is important, and it's just a balancing act because
Yeah.
you still have to advocate. So grace and advocacy are kind of like almost feel like polar opposites, but really they just work in unison. You just have to be really thoughtful as best as you
Mhm.
can, and oftentimes that means like learning by trial and error.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like you said, oh, we didn't know that they get together on Monday to do, case management of their toughest cases, but now we do, and so now we have more grace with it. So yeah, I appreciate that.
What about like the really difficult conversations that accompany the early days of a diagnosis,
Yeah.
i.e., getting, so what our doctor said to, actually he's not our doctor, what the horrible doctor, we called him Dr. Doom, said to Brian is you need to get your affairs in order. And oftentimes that means getting in case you're going to die, you need a will, you need end of life conversations. What are some of the tips that you would give to people? Because these are things people should do. I'm going to sound like a mom while you're healthy, while you can, while you're clear headed, to just knock them out and put them away and be done. But what recommendations would you make to
Yeah.
someone?
Well, I have the benefit of my parents kind of already having put together kind of um, some basic will and end of life stuff that they did kind of without us kids really knowing because there's four of us kids. Um, and so that, like you mentioned, best practice, doing that ahead of time when nothing's wrong is a really great way to kind of prepare yourself for something if something does go wrong. But that's just the beginning, right? That's more about finances and all sorts of things. But when you're going into treatment that has potential outcomes that are, death, right? Like when you have the flu, they're like, oh, you take Tamiflu, the outcome might be you get a rash. Like, I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know anything about Tamiflu, but just as a silly example, but when you're about to go through a bone marrow transplant, they're like, these are all the things that could happen. And at the end of that list is death. And it's what does that look like? Because death is a lot of things. Is it death or is it being in a coma or is it what level of consciousness are you okay with? And those are really nuanced, painful, scary conversations to have that your care team needs to know and your family needs to know to prepare for worst and best case scenario. I will say that had I not worked in hospice, those conversations would have been, they're hard. don't get me wrong. It's like no matter how long you work in any industry that where you talk about grief and death and dying, it's still hard.
Mhm.
But something a former boss said to me a long time ago that I think I said earlier in the show was sometimes you have to go toward the pointy thing in
Mhm.
order to get to the other side. You have to go through the hard stuff. You have to kind of face it. It's going to stay pointy if you just kind of inch around it. So it's always going to be there. Sometimes you just have to face it and move through it to get to the other part of it. And that was what I told myself when we had those conversations with my mom and my dad, with the care provider about the different pieces that he was okay with, was like, it's okay that this is hard and you can sit in that hardness and you can sit in the pain of it and still move forward. You don't have to avoid it. Um, and I think that emotionally was really helpful for me. But I
Mhm.
think also, if you haven't done any care planning, if you haven't done any care planning ahead of time, it might be good to have that conversation before you're in the room with a doctor because
Mhm.
they're going to have you sign all sorts of documents about what you do and don't want should anything happen. And it might be worth having longer conversations than you get in that 20 or 30 minutes in the room to sign that paperwork. So I think if you ask for that paperwork ahead of time, they'll usually tell you you're going to fill out these things this day. Sitting with your loved one and talking through those ahead of time can be really powerful because you get to have conversations with more clarity. It's just you two or the three of you or whoever's involved in the room. You get the space to talk about that as a family, and then you're prepared once you get there. You don't
Mhm.
want to have the conversation for the first time when a care professional says, "Hey, what do if you lose consciousness,
Mhm.
can we revive you? If you are paralyzed, do you want to stay that way?" Like, I mean, horrible, horrible things that no one wants to talk about, but
Yeah.
gosh, you don't want to be having that conversation for the first time when you have to sign the documents within 30 minutes. So I think being prepared before you get to that place is good, having those conversations ahead of time, and then not being afraid to have those conversations, go towards the pointy thing. And that might be a good thing. Anticipatory grief therapy can also be done in a family setting. So
Mhm.
maybe you're like, gosh, I don't even know how to have this conversation. Maybe I do need a professional to help guide us through this. That's okay too. Like, no one has to have all the answers. And sometimes having someone who can thoughtfully guide you through that exercise can be really powerful because then you don't have to hold the space. You get
Mhm.
to have the space held for you and you're navigating through it with your loved one to have that tough conversation and someone's holding that space.
Absolutely. And there's social workers at hospitals as well who can help with that. I mean, God knows
Right.
we've had so many just, pop into our lives. Sometimes we say yes. Excuse me. Sometimes we say yes, and sometimes we say no, thank you. We got this. But I
Right.
think in specific things you want to look at is a will,
Yeah.
where God forbid, death should happen or the worst should happen. Where are your belongings going to, and to whom, and
Right.
when? A power of attorney, I would
Yeah.
argue, is even more important. Power of attorney is who gets to make the tough decisions should you
Right.
be incoherent. And I think all of the nuances that you're talking about, Kelly, are so important. Like before Bryan had his brain surgery, which, we were very confident was going to go well, but I kept pestering him for like three
Mhm.
weeks ahead of time. I was like, I know you don't want to talk about this, but we have to, because if I'm
Yeah.
left holding the bag, God forbid something happens to you in your brain. What do you want to do? And his joke is, I want a Viking funeral. I was like, I'm okay. I get it. I've heard that for 14 years. It's funny. I will light you on fire in all of the ways and do whatever you want
Yeah.
me to do. But should you not require fire ceremony and you're
Right.
still hanging on, what does that mean? And what are you okay with and what are you not? And so then I'm in charge of making those decisions. So I think at a minimum, having the power of attorney conversation, having
Yeah.
the will conversation, very,
Absolutely.
very, very important decisions to
Absolutely.
have.
I
And
totally agree with you on that. I think that, I mean, like I said, I was lucky. My parents had both of those things already done, and I reviewed it with them because I hadn't looked at it before. They just did this on their own volition, and I was like, oh, well, I think your child might want to know. Your children might want to know what's going on too.
yes.
So we did have to have look through kind of what that looked like. But those two things are absolutely important. And then again, there are so many other things that you're going to face in treatment that are going to have tough tough questions with tough answers, and just being able to move through that by itself is hard. So if you can be prepared or you can do the pre-work, then you're just going to be better set up to have those conversations. And like I said, it doesn't make it easy. None of this is easy. Nothing makes it easy. It makes it possible. And I think that's the difference.
It also makes it so it's one less thing to think about.
Yeah.
It's not hanging over your head. It's like, okay, we got this. Now we can focus on moving forward with treatment. We can focus on the
Exactly.
possibilities. We don't want anyone to die. We don't want anyone to, but we also don't want our loved ones to be stuck holding it
Yeah.
and
I mean,
suffering in a time of extreme grief.
brain space is such an important part of this because you're carrying their yesterday's labs, tomorrow's appointments in your head,
Mhm.
potential research that is necessary, and then treatment plans coming up next week. You already are carrying a lot as an advocate,
Mhm.
and so the last thing you need to carry are the what ifs that you can resolve ahead of time. So like
Right.
unburden yourself.
Yes, and also this basically becomes what feels like emotionally a full-time job on top of your full-time job, on top of being, not just like a colleague and a professional, but being like
Mhm.
a wife, and certain cases like a mom or a dad or a daughter or a sister or what a friend, whatever it is.
Yeah,
There's all of these other things that already existed in your life. This is now, you're actively taking this on top of it. So the more organized you can be to free up that brain space, the better.
absolutely.
Without
It is a full-time job. It really is.
it
And
is.
life doesn't stop. I think that was something that I learned really quickly that shocked me. It was like, I thought life would stop when something this catastrophic would happen, but it doesn't. Your
Doesn't.
bills still need to be paid. Your job still needs to be attended to. Your relationships still, need fostering. Um, uh, I don't have any children, but both two of my three brothers had babies this year.
Mhm.
And so they have, babies that need to be kept alive and fed and loved and snuggled. And, none of that stops. And so, how do you navigate life and this new full time role of advocacy? And it is challenging, but it's not impossible.
How were you designated, or did you proactively take it on? Since there's four of you, and I know you're
Yeah,
the oldest. How were
I
you
am the
designated?
oldest.
Yeah,
I'm
how
the
were you made?
oldest.
You were made tribute. How did that happen?
Uh, I probably made myself tribute. I'm the oldest. I'm the only girl, which I don't think really matters necessarily, but I think in my family dynamics, I've very much been like, go team go. Like I will plan the family things we have coming up, and very much a leader in that way. So I think being the oldest probably more than anything, although each of us have taken on different roles. So I may be the lead on his healthcare advocacy, but one of my brothers is the lead on fun. And he, because I can be kind of a, advocacy can be really heavy and you can really stay in it a lot and forget to have fun and forget to live. And he comes in and he may not know anything about what's happening from a healthcare perspective, but he's like, let's put that Kings game on, like put that hockey game on, crack open some beers, go Kings, go. And, it just makes
Yes.
you feel alive again. And that is so important, mostly for my dad, but also for all of us, right? Because we're still in the midst of, treatment and diagnosis and navigating this. We're still a family and we still want to have memories together and spend time together and not make everything about leukemia. And
Mhm.
so we all kind of took on our roles that I think naturally already existed in the family. One of my brothers is a little bit more like me as in his involvement.
Mhm.
Um, and then one of them is very active, like takes him out golfing and um, shows up and cooks barbecue with him. And, even when he's not feeling well and keeps him engaged and involved. So we all took on the roles I think that were most natural for us,
Mhm.
which to me feels really good because then no one has to feel like they're not doing their part. We're all doing our part in the way that's best for us and that makes sense for us. Um, and sure, mine might have be a little bit more laborsome from a time perspective, but I'm also really good at it.
Yeah.
I'm probably good at it than maybe they are. And they're good at other things that I'm not good at. So I think that's been part of it. Um, and also, I have, like I said, I work remotely
Mhm.
and I don't have any kids. So, I had a little bit more flexibility to be in that role than my brothers who either don't work remotely or did just have newborn babies. And so we all kind of just took on the hats that made sense for us. And we're really, really close. And so it's also about communicating. So if I'm like, gosh, I'm burned out, like I'm really struggling, I need you to I need you to tap in, I'll do that. And I
Yes.
encourage anyone in an advocate role to know who that person can be and to tap them in when you feel like you're burning out, because I really am a firm believer, like if you don't put your own oxygen mask on, you can't help other people put their oxygen mask on, and there can be a burnout point or a tipping point. So there's flexibility there. We all have our roles, but right
Mhm.
now I'm at home because I have doctor's appointments. I'm not with my dad in the hospital, and my brother's jumping in because he's on paternity leave.
Yeah.
Great, look at that. We but it requires communication, and luckily that's my
Yes.
expertise. So we lean into that as much as we can.
That is amazing. You mentioned to me on a different chat that we had that like one of your superpowers is being able to take very complex, um, difficult, like complicated topics and break it down so they're easily understood. I
Yeah,
think that's such a critical element as well for someone in your position and someone in my position, because your communication, like you said, is the most important thing. But you have to know how to communicate what's going on with
yeah,
your dad in these rooms where your brothers or another family member or a sister-in-law are not present. And so
right,
how do you actually communicate in a way that they don't get frustrated because they don't understand? Because like
absolutely.
you are that linchpin. I want to talk about one thing before we get to how you're taking care of yourself, because self-care is perhaps the most it's the first thing that's forgotten and the first thing that's neglected when you're in a caregiving slash patient advocacy position. But you mentioned earlier communication and mediation and like the way that you frame conversations. But I know also reframing of a conversation and mediation is wildly critical. And I feel like you mentioned this to me earlier, but like what are the three ways you can reframe a conversation with a doctor or someone else just in general that can really help you just clarify the communication and keep the conversation going so you don't feel like you're being too aggressive, whatever, just so it has a good endpoint.
Absolutely. This is my favorite kind of skills I've learned in the last decade have been communication based, because they're so transferable in other parts of your life and in my marketing and communications role. And I think that if you just remember these key pieces and you practice them, because just like anything, like going to the gym, if you lift weights once a year, you will not have strong muscles, right? Like your arms will still be weak. Communication is similar. These skills should be practiced in other areas besides advocacy, so that when you get into that room as an advocate, you're more comfortable using them and they come more naturally to you. But I think the first is what I mentioned earlier, asking open ended questions. And so that means asking something that doesn't have an answer like yes, no, blue, green. It invites a longer answer. That means it's open. A closed question would be like, what's your favorite color? It's green.
Mhm.
So that's very closed. It's very pointed. And there's a point as you get further into a conversation that closed questions are valuable to get more details, but
Mhm.
start with open-ended questions so you can get as much information from the doctor as possible. Then once you're getting that information, some of the tools to use that I've used is validating them. So saying, gosh, I understand from your experience, this is what you've seen. So I'm really validating their experience and understanding, but then I'll jump into the thing that I'm concerned about or worried about or want more information on. Summarizing what I thought I heard. So
Mhm.
sometimes communication is a two-way street, and you're both responsible for making sure you understood the same message. And so when a doctor shares something with you, taking the time to summarize it back with them and say, this is what I think I understood, and share it back to make sure that they understand what you understand.
Mhm.
That's really powerful, because that means you're both on the same page with the same exact message. And then reframing. So sometimes some doctors don't have the best bedside manner, or maybe they're having a tough day, or maybe they just deliver communication in a way that's not the best style for you. Um, and it's a tough meeting. That happens sometimes. We're very lucky to have a great care team, but in the past, there have been a couple of tough conversations, and sometimes it's okay to reframe what you think you've heard and take the sting out of it and then check back in with them. And it actually just happened this morning with my dad's care team. And they weren't in a bad mood or anything, but something they said, it both my dad and I go, oh, that didn't sound great.
Mhm.
We both were a little bit like, ooh. And so I said, gosh, I want to just check in with you because I thought I heard this, but I think what you meant was X, Y, and Z. And because you said he wasn't excited about a test result, and you hear a doctor say that, and
Sure.
you feel alarmed. And I said, do you mean you're not excited about it because you already feel like you have an idea of what that's going to be, so you're not anticipating it? But the result itself isn't bad. He's like, oh wow, yes, so sorry. It didn't say that. I didn't mean to imply that the result was bad. I just meant that I'm not anticipating with
Mhm.
excitement the rest of the results because we already have a sense of what that's going to look like. And so
Yes.
reframing it and taking the sting out of it, or like the hard to hear thing, and repeating it back to check for clarity can be really, really powerful to make sure you're on the same page. Because had I not done that, my dad would have left that call saying, well, they got a really bad test result and they're not very happy with it. Um, and so you have to be able to use those skills of validation, reframing, summarizing, and knowing when to ask open versus closed questions in order to facilitate dialogue in a way that you're feeling heard, but you're
Mhm.
also becoming informed, right? It's a mutual thing. Like, you want to give the doctor the opportunity to share, but you also need the time for you to share and ask questions. And they are helpful in building understanding with your doctor, both them understanding you and vice versa, but also making sure you understand the same message. And I can tell you a million ways that communication can go sideways, and that's a 30-minute segment on its own. But so it's not going to be perfect, and you're not looking for perfection. You're just trying to build understanding, and
Mhm.
that's what those tools are for. And if you practice it in your workplace, and you practice it with your family, and you practice it with friends, and you practice those skills, it's going to become more natural and effortless when you're an advocate. So I definitely encourage people to say, like, don't expect to go and being a perfect communicator with your doctor if you're not practicing it in other areas of your life. So, it's certainly a skill that gets developed over time, but it's possible, and you can work on it just like anything else.
The other thing I think that's unsaid in this is that over time, like people who are patient advocates and caregivers will develop their own triggers and their own PTSD. And so the conversation, my God, I'm so thrilled that you have this experience to jump back in and say, what I heard you say was, did you actually mean XYZ, to reframe that meeting? Because like Brian's neuro-oncologist said once, more than 50% of this is mental. Like like your attitude, your mind frame, your outlook on this. Like if you don't have a positive outlook that like, yes, we can overcome, yes, we can do these things,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of patients just kind of slip away because they don't have the fortitude to fight and commit. But imagine, like you said, had you guys walked out of that appointment or you hung up from that appointment and thought, oh my God, like this is bad. And
Yeah,
then the spiral, right? Like the downward spiral that both of you and your family could have gone in from a miscommunication.
right.
That is wildly important, so you don't fall victim, to your triggers in the meeting or in the appointment, but you're able to control that and clarify, and so you can have the best, clarity possible.
Yeah, I think the trauma that accompanies this journey, when you receive really hard news, when you're told like you don't have long, or this is going to be a tough battle,
Yeah.
and it's this percent chance, um, that that trauma stays with you,
Mhm.
and it's sitting there waiting to be re-triggered again. And I certainly have had moments in the last year where I've been devastated and it's been traumatizing for whatever reason, whether it was a bad interaction with a doctor, or really tough news, or just really highly emotional conversations that you weren't expecting to have. But
Yeah.
I think that if you can at least use these skills to build understanding, you're going to at least avoid, more of that and re-triggering those traumas. I don't think it's everything. That's why I'm going to anticipatory grief therapy. I may be a communication specialist, but I still know that I need to work through the trauma of this with somebody else. But it's just another tool in your toolkit. You
Yeah.
need a whole toolkit to deal with these things, and that's just one of them.
Yeah. I mean, and knowing what they are, right? To like like literally going to the hospital and like sitting, it's always in like exam room 5 or 6. Like I start to get literally like the heebie jeebies, like even
Yeah,
thinking about it right now, thinking about that room, because there's been wonderful moments, but then there's been so many not great moments. So knowing where your triggers are and preparing ahead of time to like keep yourself calm, keep yourself level-headed, or don't do it. Like there's been times where I'm like, I actually can't go to this. I'm going to dial in. I'm going to be right on FaceTime with you.
Yeah.
But like my anxiety is so high right now. I can't do it. Right. Or sending someone else and dialing in. So, um,
Our body holds memories, and we have
yes.
physiological responses to trauma that are in our memories, and you have to be really conscious of when you can jump in and when you need space,
Yeah.
because your body doesn't help anyone if it's in that, if you're being re-traumatized, you're going into fight or flight. You're not
Yeah.
able to be a good advocate anyway, so you have to be really in tune with yourself, which
Yeah.
is hard to do sometimes when you're so busy managing life and cancer all at once.
So how, to that end, how are you taking care of yourself?
Well, that's a good, that's a good question. Besides therapy, which I have found to be really, really meaningful, it's really hard to process with family members the grief that you're feeling because you're protecting each other.
Hmm.
No one wants to make another person feel sad about what they're feeling. You're protecting um, your siblings or your parents from how you're feeling because it's hard for them to hear how hard you're having it and vice versa. And so everyone's always kind of in that protection mode. And so you can't always be fully transparent the
Hmm.
way that you would want to be to process something. And so therapy has been really powerful. And that doesn't mean I don't have conversations with my family members or my friends, but there's something about someone who's really good at their job
Hmm.
to sit there for an hour and you get to be incredibly selfish and just talk about what's on your mind and process that with someone, and you don't have to worry about reciprocity, and you
Hmm.
don't have to worry about caring about their feelings or how this is affecting them. There's a beautiful release in that, and it allows me to selfishly process what I need to process, that is quite unique. That's different from any relationship. And that doesn't mean I don't get great support from family or from friends or from my partner, but it is something that I think is, like I talked about the toolkit. You want to have emotional support from your people, but you also need therapy to accompany it. And you also need communication skills when you're, in the advocacy role. So they're all unique and important, and you want to have all of them and not
Hmm.
just one single thing that you're relying on, because you're going to have to adapt as you move through this marathon of cancer,
Yeah.
and you never know what's going to happen, so you need to have as many resources available as possible.
Yeah.
And also really exercise a lot. I try and get out in nature, and that's good for me because I have a lot of anxiety, and so that helps my body get back to like its physical homeostasis.
Yeah.
And I find myself, my nervous system being deregulated, especially after really tough meetings. So getting my system re-regulated through exercise or nature is really powerful for me.
Hmm.
Deep breathing also helps regulate your nervous system, and it sounds so silly, but I swear by it. So I mean, and everything that works for me may not work for someone else, but these are things that work for me.
Yeah.
Um, and and then, I worked with the doctor and saying, look, if things get really hard, I was having really bad panic attacks. Is there medication I can lean on? Should I not be able to continue forward?
Yeah.
Living as normal of a life as possible. Is there something that would support me? And I had never had medication before, but my doctor was able to work with me and say, these are for emergency only, or if this is something you want to start on, we can start you on that. And it was nice to be able to even start that conversation with my doctor and say, hey, I might need help. We're 8 months into this, and I'm starting to feel real burnout and real anxiety in a way that's affecting me in my life.
Yes.
And not being afraid to have that conversation, because there's just so much stigma around mental health. And I had never been in that position before. And being new to that, I thought, I don't know what should I do. And having
Yeah.
a doctor that you trust, who cares about your mental health and your physical health, say, I've got you, and let's come
Yes.
up with a plan, was really helpful.
And not, I mean, like the whole thing you're talking about too is not assigning shame or judgment to yourself at
Yeah.
all, because honestly, for anyone who's going through this on our side of things, like you feel that enough from other people, like who don't have any idea what's going on in your situation. And, I mentioned the grief episode that grief and patient advocacy and going through all of this and caregiving, it changes your address book, right? Like it does. And relationships change, and you can grieve relationships and friendships that were something beforehand, that aren't anymore. It's like this is so multi-layered. So you need to find your people who, like, I've got 4 or 5 friends that, like, there are no holds barred at any time of the day or night. Like, they are there
Yeah.
about anything. It does not matter. Like, it can be nasty, it can be ugly, it can be dirty. It doesn't matter. Like, it's life or death, and they know that. And they're my girls. They're my people.
Yeah.
So you don't have to do it alone.
Yeah, that really struck a chord with me because it's been, I think, one of the more surprising parts of this journey. Sorry, it makes me so emotional. I think when you think of cancer, you think of the disease as being like the biggest part of your grief journey, but the reality is so much of your life changes. Your relationships, your friendships, what you're capable of doing and not doing. I mean, we have to be really safe because he has leukemia, and so his immune system's compromised. It's a blood cancer. His immune system's compromised.
Yep.
So we can't do a lot of things that other people are doing post, but it's still COVID in my brain
Yeah.
because COVID's
Right.
still out there, and COVID, he can't get COVID, and relationships have changed, and it feels like I'm in a different season of life where my needs as a friend are different, and that has changed my friendships with people, some for the better and some aren't as strong as they used to be, and it's that by itself is grief.
Yes.
I'm grieving my old life. I'm grieving the life where I used to be able to live freely. I'm grieving a life where my relationships looked like I wanted them to. And it's not bad or good because there are certainly some relationships that have really risen to the occasion that I think have made our relationship stronger.
Yeah.
But it's still, there's some loss in that, right? There's some gain and there's some beauty in it. And you have those people and you lean into them and you're stronger for it. But part of the grief journey is grieving the life you had beforehand and what that life looked like. And I wasn't really prepared for that, to be honest. And that was a huge reason of why therapy was really helpful because it's
Yeah.
complicated and your expectations are so high of people. Like, wow, but people have their own, everyone's lives moves forward while you're just sitting in this. And that is so hard. It's so hard and so painful. And you need someone to navigate that with you and figure out why that's happening and how to release that and move through that grief.
Yeah. The one of the final things that I'll say is, like, early days when we had some, I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, like some people who I genuinely thought for sure would be like right there, ride or die, were nowhere to be found. And some of the other people who I, came out of the woodwork, and it's changed over time, right? Certainly people come
Right.
in, come out since we've been in this for so long. But Bryan said very astutely in the beginning of this, when I was so angry with some friends who just, like, were nowhere to be found, he's like, you can't judge them based on, like, their reaction. You can't control it. And I was like, because you feel very much out of control of all of this.
Yeah.
Like, you're doing the best you can to maintain control, but you feel so out of control. And people who want to be there are going to be there. And it's kind of like dating. It's like,
Yeah.
if they want to be there with you, they're going to be there with you. If they want to, you're a patient advocate or a caregiver, people want to be there for you, they're going to be there for you regardless. And you have to focus on those relationships while also grieving the others, but realizing that, like, maybe it doesn't matter why they're not there. Maybe they couldn't handle it. Maybe they don't want a downer friend sometimes, because God knows I can be a downer. Like, I don't really give a shit talking about stupid little things. Like, there's real things going on in life. So, like, let's make it count. Let's make it important. Like, you can go have those old dumb conversations, whatever, you know what I mean? But, like,
Absolutely.
it's hard. And so I try not to focus on the people that have kind of left. It's given me a sense of, like, perspective on the
Mhm.
people who are here, really the ones that matter. But it still hurts my heart of the ones that aren't. I can't
Yeah,
lie,
I think you can hold two things in your hand at once. I think my
Yeah.
hospice work has really taught me that like death and dying is still so rejected in our society and nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about hard things like that. We still haven't found the words as a society to really process death and dying in a healthy way where
Mhm.
it can be part of regular conversation. They say don't talk about religion, politics, or death and dying in dinner as dinner topics. And the reality is, I disagree with that. I think those are really important things that we need to lean into. But I was lucky to learn that through my work.
Mhm.
And so I try and remind myself that not everyone has either had an experience or learned that yet. And we're all in varying places in our journey to understand death and dying and hard things like that and
Yeah.
have grace with people. And I can have grace with someone and still feel disappointed and sad and grieve that friendship because it's not serving me, right? Both of those things are true at the same time. And I can honor how I'm feeling and still have compassion for where they're not yet. That makes me sound like I am just the most thoughtful person ever. And I'll tell you, I haven't always had moments like that. I have had moments where I'm upset and I'm angry and I'm sad, but I eventually get there. It just takes some time. So it's certainly not like I'm not just, this graceful butterfly moving through this process so easily, but it is kind of the wisdom I get to eventually.
Yeah. I mean, we all are. It's the same thing. I mean, I just want, in case no one has said this to you in a while, like, I just want to like validate and reassure you, like, you're doing amazing. And this is so hard.
Yeah.
This is so hard. And you've learned things that you never wanted to learn. I've learned things I've never wanted to learn, but like, we're able to help people with this information. And like, your dad is strong and he's doing great and he's going to start this drug that will hopefully be great. My husband is maybe less strong, less fit, but he's doing great and he's going to start this medication. At the end of the day, all we have with this is hope and to share and to connect on ways that we can just share this information and help people get through it, just like we're doing our best. But like, you're not alone. I'm here. You have family, you have friends, vice versa, but you are doing amazing. And I'm really proud of you.
Christy. That means a lot coming from basically a warrior, a 10-year warrior in this, that really means a lot. I feel really grateful to be here to talk through this with you. I think this is such important information, and a lot of it I wish I knew ahead of time. So I think what you're doing is incredible work. It's labor that needs to be done for other people, and the fact that you're doing that on top of the advocacy you're already doing is pretty incredible. And I'm really wishing the best for your husband in this trial, and I hope everyone will kind of join me in thoughts, prayers, vibes, energy, whatever is your jam, as my dad will have his bone marrow transplant next week. So we start a clinical trial tomorrow and bone marrow transplant next week, and just really hoping the best for both for our family members. So, and thank you for having me on.
Oh my God, this has been such a special conversation, and I'm sure one of many, but thank you so much for taking the time and sharing all of your expertise.
Of course, happy to do so.
Well, that's it. Another episode of What Nobody Tells Us. I hope you learned something. I hope you felt something. And I hope you feel empowered to go start a conversation with somebody who you know might be going through something that you don't understand. Lean in. Don't peace out. Thanks so much for spending some of your day with me today. I really, really love that you did that. If you want to reach out, if you got an idea for an episode, you just want to give me some feedback or just say, hey, do so at Nobody Tells Us on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, or X, whatever we're calling it these days. No one knows. Reach out, Christy at nobodytellsus.com. Shoot me an email there or visit my website, www.nobodytellsus.com. Until next time, see you later.